Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Anonymous Hedgehog podcast. My name is Maya.
And I'm Rich.
And we will be your hosts. So, on today's episode, we're going to be talking about whether or not water is actually wet. So, my view on this is that water is wet because,
What?
Okay, I think that water is wet because, water, okay, so wetness is the property of, for example, having water on it. But when water, because water is never alone, if that makes sense. Water is always submerged in other water. So water always has other water on it. So then water is wet.
Well, that implies that water is in layers. So, let me just take a step back and say what I think. I think that water is not wet because for something to be wet, it has to have water on it. And water doesn't have water on it because water is water. Right. So for you to say that water is layered on top of itself, well, then let's consider the topmost layer. That layer doesn't have any water on it. So are you saying that some water is wet and some water isn't wet?
I'm not talking about the layer. I'm talking about if you think of water molecules, unless you were to isolate a single water molecule, but in that case, I would still say it's wet. It's because it's the same thing. The color orange. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. Mm-hmm. It's the same, are you, Richie? Yeah, you are, because you are rich. It's the same, it's just changing, it's just basically turning a noun into an adjective, kind of, because,
Well, no, because saying is the color orange isn't the same thing, because applying orange to something doesn't make it orange. It makes it a mix of those two colors. So orange is itself not a property that can be applied to other things. Whereas with water, applying water to something else makes it wet, whereas water itself cannot be wet.
But the problem is water is never isolated. Water is always in other water. It's always, water molecules are always surrounded by other water molecules.
Yeah, so when you that argument seems promising when you talk about the molecules itself. I didn't think about
because
small of a level.
Because the thing is wetness is the property of having water on it, but water also has water on it because it's surrounded by other water.
Right, but conventionally, if something has one single molecule of water on top of it, we would never call it wet, right? There's a threshold of what we decide is wet.
Well, I guess it's not that we wouldn't call it wet, it's that we can't tell it is wet. But if we knew it had water on it, we would probably say it's wet. It's just if a single water molecule, you can't actually tell if that's wet.
Well, then that just takes away from the whole definition of wet, because in that case, everything would be wet because everything has at least one molecule of water on it. And in a humid environment, technically all things are wet. But you wouldn't say a desert is wet. That just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, this is interesting, kind of when you talk about in humidity,
mm-hmm.
There's a point where in a certain weather, even though you're not it's not raining, if it's humid to a certain point, you are wet.
So then is the air wet in that case?
The air? I don't know. It's just if for example, when you're traveling to Florida and it's super humid outside, then you would be kind of wet. You would feel sticky.
Right, but okay, so
there is a threshold, I guess. But I feel the threshold is not really it's not really a number or exact. It's just more of what we can detect.
Yeah, it is what we can detect. And so I guess that's where the subjectivity comes in. But even then, it shouldn't matter, because even if we're talking about hundreds of gallons of water, if you go deep into the ocean, all of the water is submerged with hundreds of gallons of water, which is far over any threshold that we're talking about. But I would still disagree that water itself is wet.
Okay, but for example, fish or whatever, organisms that live in water their entire life, would they be wet? Them never having encountered dry land, would they be wet? Because I would argue yes, they are wet, even though they're because the truth is I feel we don't actually Yeah, I don't know. Like, would something like if you just lived in water your whole life, would you actually be wet?
Yeah, I don't think a fish is wet because a fish is in water. Like the fish is wet when it comes out of the water.
So you only characterize this as like basically like having water, like the property of having water on something when it's not in like an environment of water. So it has to be like dry, like the environment around it has to be dry, but it's the only thing that is like has water on it. Because if everything else it has water on it, then it wouldn't be. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so I'm not actually thinking about water when I classify something as wet. I'm thinking about air.
Yeah, you're thinking about like it's. I feel like yours is more like the contrast. Like it's kind of like relative wetness. If that makes sense. Like it's like the contrast between the dry land and like the fish that would be out of water. That would be wet in your definition, right?
Yeah, it's like the lack of air that's replaced by water, not just the amount of water.
I think my
It's
definition is more of just like it has water on it. Like it if something has water on it, then it's wet. So like okay, so like when you're drinking like when you're drinking like tea or something, is the inside of your cup wet?
Well, it depends on what part of the cup you're talking about. So if you're talking about the cup above the water level that just has driplets on the cup, I'd say that is wet. But the actual portion of water in, or like the
Okay.
tea in the tea can't be wet because tea is already a fluid, right?
Not the tea, but like the cup, like the part of the cup around the tea.
Well, I guess we'll never know, right? Like we'll never know if it's wet or not because
Oh, so
because
like
it's
I'm saying like
submerged.
in your so in my definition that would be wet, but I guess under your definition of wet that wouldn't be wet. Cuz like I
Well,
would
I
just
mean,
say it's wet
I'm not even
regardless.
100% sure yet because now you're questioning like the boundaries of my beliefs. Like I'm 100% sure that the tea itself is not wet, but now you're talking about the cup that borders the tea and if that's wet. And honestly, like I think I need more time to think about that.
Okay, I feel like okay, so since we've been talking about this for a while, I feel like it's worth questioning. Like this is something I feel like this is a trend. Like why do we ask like why does our generation feel the need to ask these type of questions? Like I feel like this is something that's always bothered me. I know it's like kind of weird transition, but like I feel like there's been such a trend to ask these kind of like quirky questions, if that makes sense. Like, is cereal like or like is cereal a soup or like is hot dog a sandwich or something like that? Like, why do we?
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Sorry, that was Siri. Okay, like why do we need to like why do we feel the need to ask these types of weird questions?
Interesting question.
Oh my gosh, shut the
That is so ironic that you're talking about questions and she's not able to understand the questions. And I'm not able to understand the questions. And I don't think the purpose of asking these questions is ever to get a definitive answer. Because I think the intrigue of these questions comes from the fact that they're not objective truths. And
so
just questioning the principles that have been defined throughout your life, like for example the concept of like if something is wet or not, that is something we learned as like toddlers, and questioning it like 20 years into the future is just something that blows your mind.
yeah, I think it's just like it shows like the really subjectivity of kind of language, like of words. Like our words don't actually mean what we think that they mean. We kind of take for granted. It's kind of like the idea we're talking about. Like we kind of take for granted that everyone else's definition of words is the same as our definition of words. It's like when we're saying like color, like we kind of take for granted like when I see green, you see green, like the same green that I see. But like the truth is we use all these words when we're talking to other people, but we don't actually realize that our definition like is probably different than what someone else is thinking.
It's so interesting that you put the focus of this problem on language and not the world, right? Like the question of is water wet, is that a question of is the definition of water as stated in English dictionary like agreed on, or is it a question of is the actual physical property of water wet? right? Like it's like, are we questioning our language by asking that question? Are we questioning the definitions in our dictionary by asking that question? Or are we questioning the properties that exist in the world, like water?
Oh. So is like wetness or like, is that something that actually exists? Like, I feel like that's just, I mean, obviously it exists, but it's just like, we've kind of created that definition too. Like,
Yeah, so is that a facet of our language? Or is that like a facet of the world? Like, is that an actual property?
yeah.
Can we even say anything is an actual property of the world? Because everything we say is a property is just represented through language.
Yeah, exactly. So I was like watching this philosophy video, and it was kind of talking about like the first properties and the second properties of like an object, and it was talking about like how like, for example, like we, like if we look at an apple, like we can't distinguish, like for example, we can't see an apple without color. So like, so they were saying like the first properties are like properties that actually exist, and then second properties are properties that we have kind of created. And so the first property would be like the shape or like the density and like the actual physical characteristics. But they were saying like we can't observe the first properties without observing the second properties. So for example, like we can't see an apple without like color. Like whenever you envision an apple, you either, if you try to envision it without color, you still envision some color into it. It just might not be like like red. Like you might see it white or you might see it clear, but that still is like a color.
Yeah, so like our own interpretations of the world always bias the objective reality every time.
Yes. So like, are any of these things like really objective reality? You know, because like we are creating language, and like
Yeah.
whenever we try to view objective reality, like we always put our interpretation into it. Like
Exactly. Yeah, that's so interesting. We always bias it. And I can't think of a way to just think of like my desk in front of me as an objective object. Like I'm always imagining like the color of the desk. And that's also influenced. I guess you're talking about first level, second level. And third level would probably be like the lighting in my room changing the way the color of my desk looks to me. So second level is the way my brain changes the objective reality. Third level is the way my like actual environment changes objective reality. And then all of these, I'm sure there's a fourth and fifth layer if we talk about it, and all of these things just end up morphing reality to
so
something
like,
that just isn't real.
does objective reality like exist? I feel like this is so weird to think about, like, because the way that I see things is different than the way that you see things.
Yeah, we talked about this on another episode, and like I have a friend who's colorblind, and
Okay.
you know, he, even something as simple as like playing a video game, he'll be like, "Oh, I didn't see you hiding in like the bushes because the bushes were green." And like to me, like hiding in the bushes would objectively make me like hiding in the bushes would objectively make me still there, right? Like I wouldn't objectively disappear, but for his reality, I was like just gone.
This is so interesting, like the question. It's like, if we didn't exist to perceive the world, would the world still exist?
This is like that
It's
like
I feel like it's like Schrodinger's cat. That's what I was
Yeah.
thinking of. Like, if no one is there to like open like the bunker or whatever and see if the cat is alive,
Yeah.
like, I don't know, like, does any of it still like exist? Like, it's not even like if the cat is dead or alive. It's like, does the cat even exist if
Like
like no one?
is there even a box? Is there even a cat? Like is
Yeah,
there anything?
like, that's so like, if, because yeah, like we could all just be kind of, this kind of goes back to like living in like the Matrix, and like it's all our perception. So like we can never be sure if anything is actually physically there. And the concept of something being objective and something being physically present is also our interpretation.
Exactly.
Like,
Just
because talking about your friend, like that like for him, like I guess the objectiveness would be like you weren't physically there. Like that was actually his reality.
Yeah. And like it's easy to see that there's no objective reality when like our objective realities disagree and we're right next to each other and we're still seeing different things. Have you ever like gone on vacation for like multiple weeks or months, and you think back to your house at home, and you think back to like, oh, like I wonder what's going on back home, and like you're in a different time zone, and it's just hard to like process that like life is still going on as usual at your house with a different time zone.
I feel like this is also the question, like, if a tree falls in the woods and there's no one here, does it still make a sound? Like, if we're not there to perceive it, do those things actually still exist?
No, I've always thought of that quote as really stupid, but now after this, just like, it's only been 15 minutes, and now after this, it seems so profound.
Yeah, like, it's super weird, like, do you ever think, like, if the entire world just, like, closed their eyes at once, like everything could disappear, and then we would never realize, if that makes sense. Like, if we cease to exist, like, we would never know if the world is actually still there.
Yeah, and it goes along with, like, I don't know if you remember, but, like, in physics, there's this concept of, like, dark matter.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's, like,
that.
Yeah, what did you find out? How much of, like, the universe is dark matter?
Yeah, I think it's the whole idea. It's, like, the matter that what we think of traditionally as matter only makes up like 5% of the universe or whatever. And then like there's like, I don't know, there's some other stuff, and then like 75% is like dark matter, which like matter we can't
perceive.
Or like, yeah, it's like matter we can't perceive. And also it's like this matter still like influences like interactions within the universe. Like it has like, it's matter, so it has like gravity. And so like the reason that they were able to detect it is like indirectly through like the gravitational motion, because like if the only matter that existed was the matter that we can see and that we can perceive, then like the gravitational interactions would be kind of different. I think that was what I
doesn't that make your mind just spin? Like the fact that there are things that exist with gravitational pulls, the very definition of mass, but we just can't see them, we just can't hear them, we can't feel them, we can't detect them, but they exist and they make up the majority of this universe.
It's so, because then like the physical, like our physical reality is limited by our biological capabilities. Like we can't see certain things. So like, do those things actually exist? So for example, like dogs or whatever have really bad vision. So like they can't perceive the reality that we perceive. But then there is like reality that exists outside of our perception.
Yeah. And one of the like examples I like to go back to, you said like our biological nature limits like our physical perception. I think that's a really good way to put it. And like if you think about an ant, like just try explaining to an ant that there is more to the world than like the twig that it's sitting on. Or try explaining to an ant that there are societies and there's cars and everything. And like you're probably thinking like he's stupid, like how are you going to explain that to an ant, right? And now just think of us as the ant. Like we are the ant. Try explaining to us the 95% of dark matter that exists. Try explaining to us all of the realities that exist that we just cannot perceive because of our biological limitations. Like in that case, we are the ant. And what's to say that we are the upmost species that can perceive everything? Like if there's species below us, like ants that can't perceive everything, then you can sure as hell guarantee that there are species above us that can perceive more than us, therefore meaning we can't perceive nearly any of what's objective reality.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. Like, but what if, like, you know how we were talking about like life existing outside of Earth? Like, what if we just can't perceive that life? You know, like, what if that life existed, for example, kind of like dark matter existed? And it's like they like look at us like we're the ants, you know, like,
exactly.
They perceive so much of what we don't see. And it's kind of the idea, like, you know how you think like dogs, like they actually can perceive things that we can't. Like they can hear certain like frequencies of sound. And that's so crazy. Like there are just like for the idea that like there could just be like a billion like really high frequencies of sound just playing and you just won't hear it.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
you're
like,
talking about sound. Like, what if there's
yeah.
another sense? Like, we're only talking about sound and like smell and hearing and taste. But, well, I already said hearing, but like
Yeah.
the five senses. But like, what if dogs can have like a sixth, seventh, eighth sense? But we'll just never know because we can never have those senses. So we'll never be able to relate to that.
Yeah, and it's the idea, like, you know, like, I remember being so confused when I first learned, like, in physics, like, the electromagnetic spectrum, like, visible light is only, like, this, like, tiny sliver, right? And then they have, like, infrared and X-rays and whatever. Like, think, like, are there organisms that can see, like, in infrared light, like, in X-ray light? Like, that's crazy. Like,
there's just so much data that exists at any given point, at any place in the universe. And we're only able to comprehend, like, probably less than 1% of it, right? If you think about all the different like types of light and all the different types of matter, and of course like there's stuff that we haven't even figured out that there exists, like I'm sure we can only comprehend less than 1% of what the universe has to offer.
I think it's interesting because, like, I feel like science has partially kind of made up for that gap in our perception, but do you think science can ever, like, do you think even science can confirm a objective reality?
Oh, never.
Never?
No, because like science will always be limited by our own biological reasoning.
Yeah,
right? Like,
science
you can't
is...
develop a sixth sense through some object that you make, because for you to be able to perceive a sixth sense, you need some biological factor built in within you to perceive that.
Yeah, and also science is created by us, so like it's also influenced by our perceptions.
Yeah, it's like saying, assume that we only had four senses and we did not have the ability to taste, right? And we developed, and we knew that there was some fifth sense called taste, and we wanted to somehow experience it, but we only had four senses.
Okay.
The only way we could experience taste is by representing it visually, or representing it as a smell, or representing it as like audio. And like, how can you represent taste as like a smell? Like, you can't. It's the same thing. Like, we only have five senses. We will never be able to objectively see something that can only be interpreted by a sixth sense that we don't have.
Yeah, it's again like science is even like limited by our biological, like, because like the thing is, like, when you mention taste, like, if you were to explain to someone what taste is, like, you can't even begin to explain to them. Like, if they didn't have taste, like, how would you even explain what taste is? So, like, even if we were to try to find a sixth sense that we didn't have, we wouldn't even know where to start, because we have, like, our brains can only comprehend five senses. Like, where does, like, how would we even begin to find a sixth sense? Same thing, like, I've always felt this with, like, when we talk about into physics, like the dimensions, like, try to imagine a world in 4 dimensions. Like,
yeah, you can't.
Like you can't even like begin to imagine like how, because like 3 dimensions is like the limit. Like, how can something like, how can like my phone or my laptop have 4 dimensions? Like, what does that even mean? You know?
And I'm sure there's like if you were to just go up to someone without having this 20-minute conversation before, and say like, oh, like there's a 4th dimension and like we just can't see it, like they'd call you crazy. But logically speaking, there's a 1 dimension that we can imagine easily. There's a 2 dimension. There's a 3 dimension. So what's to say that there isn't a 4th that we're just biologically limited to perceive?
That's so, I feel like in like some scientists say like there is like, isn't there like infinite dimensions, I guess?
I've read an article about how there's something like 1,000 dimensions, and it's just like impossible for us to even wrap our heads around them. Like, no computer, even a computer simulation can't represent that, because like a computer screen is 2D.
Yeah,
or like a
it's like,
hologram is 3D. Like, you, in order to represent a 4th dimension, you need to be able to perceive a 4th dimension, which you can't.
yes. Yeah, like, we are, I guess, the ants in this scenario. It's just like, you can't even like, if there is a person, like, there could be people like not like objects, whatever, that exist in 4th dimension. Like, if they try to explain to us what it means to have 4 dimensions, like, we can't, like, that's the same thing as explaining society to an ant. Like, it just doesn't make sense to them.
Yeah. And like, I'm thinking about how how we have all of these like radio receptors trying to catch signals from higher beings.
Yeah.
Like, what if ants want to see if there's humans? Like, what are they going to do? They're going to like crawl on your fingers, but they still can't see you're a human. They can't tell, right? It's the same thing. Like, we're trying, us bringing up these radio receptors and trying to catch these signals from aliens is the same thing as like ants just crawling on like a finger. Like, we'll never be able to even imagine and interpret the signals from a higher being, because our signals to an ant would be like talking and language, but they can never ever be able to interpret that.
Yeah, so this is so weird because like, so then what is like, because physics, like I'm studying physics in college, so this is super like weird for me to think about. It's just like physics is the idea of like you're trying to understand the universe, but like if we just accept the fact that we will never understand the universe, like we will, like there is no way, like, you know, like everything that we are doing, like it's just so limited by our biological predispositions, our biological ability to perceive things. So like what is the point if we know that we're never going to get there?
Yeah. Like what is the point? Honestly though, like again, even though we can only perceive like less than 1%, where we are right now is less than 1%, right? Like,
Yeah.
like we need to study physics just to reach our potential. And just because that potential is low doesn't mean that we should just give up in reaching it, right?
Yeah. This almost makes me think back to the episode we talked about, like ignorant bliss. Like, in a sense, humans do live in an ignorant bliss, if that makes sense. Like we only see our small fraction of the universe, and in a sense that is ignorant bliss. Like if we only care about like science as it pertains to us, and we only care about our kind of small fraction of science that we can perceive, but there's so much science and stuff out there that we can't perceive.
And I guess, yeah, like the reason why it's blissful ignorance is because if we were, like, let's say all of a sudden, like we were able to perceive all science, that would be so overwhelming. We would like literally physically die, because we wouldn't be able to process all the different like wavelengths of light and all of the different matter that exists. Like it would just be so much on our brain and on our physical senses that we would die. So I guess it is blissful that we aren't able to process that right now.
Yeah, it's like the type of like information overload kind of idea. So like, isn't it so then what is, I guess, the point of science, if that makes sense? Like, I guess we just use science to benefit us. So we don't actually, I guess we don't use it really to understand the world. We kind of just use it to benefit us.
Well, we use it to understand what we can understand, right?
Yeah.
I feel like, do you think that like they teach us in schools that we will never be able to learn the utmost capability?
I think that they don't ever teach you, I don't think that they would ever teach you that in school. I think that humans also have this idea of like, this is probably the same for all organisms. Like humans have this idea that we are like the top like tier organism, like you were talking about. Like we like look down on ants, like, yeah, they can never understand us and whatever. I think that we kind of have this like narcissism where like our species, like we think our species is like the most powerful. We've built all these like skyscrapers, this whole society. And like, I think humans kind of, this is why some people like for studying physics is kind of overwhelming, because like you realize that you really don't actually matter at all. You know, like you realize that our Earth is so small in like the solar system and in the Milky Way galaxy and in the universe and like whatever. And so like I think it's like going back to the blissful ignorance thing. Like some people just prefer to think of their world as the world, as like the only world that exists.
Yeah. Do you think that mentality is healthy though? Because I mean, if we didn't think that way, and if we did always think like, oh, like we don't matter, we would make no advancements in technology, and we would just have no motivation to even learn about what we can learn about.
I think it's the whole idea of like going back to the episode where we talked about like conspiracy theories in the Matrix. It's just like, yeah, so like what is the point of questioning all that? It's like it's just easier to stay ignorant because like we said, like there is no way we can like we can't change anything about that. Like we can't perceive what we just biologically can't perceive. So there's physically no point in trying to understand all of it because we'll never be able to.
Yeah. No, that's so true. But that's very demotivating. Like if you taught kids that, they would not want to learn.
Like I almost feel like once you learn, like once you understand this, you almost can't shut it off. Like, you know, like I mean, obviously I can go about my normal life and like just, you know, pretend like, you know, like this is the only world that exists. But like there's always like I still remember that in the back of my mind, if that makes sense. Like once I have this realization that we actually don't matter and that human beings are so limited, then like I can kind of fool myself into thinking otherwise, but I still remember it. Like I still know it.
I feel like for me it's almost the opposite. Like even though I'm constantly reminding myself that like I mean nothing and humanity is nothing, I always end up like being narcissistic and like thinking about like things that really don't matter a little bit too much. Because like that mentality of like nothing matters should allow you to live your life at the fullest because your life doesn't matter, so you might as well live it at the fullest. But like I feel like unless I keep reminding myself, I'll forget and then I'll overthink.
Yeah, it's like it seems like the idea of nothing matters should motivate you to live your life to the fullest, but what it really is for most people is demotivating. Like, you know, nothing I do matters.
Yeah, there's two sides of it.
Yeah.
There's two sides of it. It's like it's either like, oh my gosh, like we're so small. Okay, I'm gonna go party. Or it's like, oh my gosh, we're so small. Like there's no point. Why am I here?
This is a weird thing to think about, but like think about like if you were to like kill a person, you know, like if you were to kill a person, like that would be such a big deal. But it actually doesn't even matter, like in like the whole scheme, the grand scheme of things. That makes sense. Like this. So then what is, I feel like the realization is then what is like, people would have this realization and they would just go around like doing whatever the hell they wanted, like killing people and taking their property and like, because it actually doesn't matter in the whole grand scheme of like the entire world, entire universe.
What would be an interesting study would be to give a questionnaire to everyone who's murdered someone or committed an extreme crime and ask them questions about how they view humanity and see if their responses differ from normal people in the sense that they view humanity as less significant than normal people.
Wait, that's so interesting because it's like if I were to commit a crime, like I would feel like really like bad and like burdened by that.
But it doesn't matter.
Yeah, but there are some people that probably don't feel that way. They're just like, yeah, like whatever, you know, like I just stole some stuff and like it doesn't actually, it's just like, you know, it's stuff is just material and you can just take it. And that's so weird to think about. It's
the concept of like when I kill a fly, I don't think twice. But if a fly were to kill another fly, like I'm sure in the fly community, like that just doesn't happen. Like you don't see flies killing other flies because it's a big deal for a fly to kill another fly. But if we are able to get ourselves into the mindset that we are the flies, then it should be no problem at all to kill each other.
That's so weird. Yeah, I think it's probably better if society doesn't think this way.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would like, we would just descend into like absolute anarchy.
I mean, maybe not, because anarchy like oftentimes goes against the individual. Like individuals murdering can benefit an individual, but at the end of the day, like in order for someone to like feel loved and like at home, they kind of want a society. So maybe not, but that's a different discussion.
Yeah, we can just end the episode here. That was super interesting. Okay, thank you everyone for listening, and we'll see you all next time.